agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Karsten.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this morning?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm running behind on a whole lot of things. I sort of feel like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer trying to pass a bill by Thursday, and here it is Saturday morning.
There you go. There you go. And we will certainly get into that.
Yes, I'm still trying to get to what I was supposed to get done Thursday, if you follow me. So.
I get it. Absolutely. We will get to that as well. Before we get to that and other things, we want to thank our newest supporters, Michael, Tucker, and Tyler, who's been a supporter for a while, who increased his level of support, as well as new supporters on PayPal and made one-time contributions, Brian, Mary, and Matthew. Matthew passed along this message with his pledge of support. Actually, it was on Patreon, I believe, but he wrote, "I'm a longtime listener and was always on the verge of becoming a supporter, but your recent episode where you stood up for Kristen and her right to her opinion without being attacked was inspiring. It convinced me to help support the work that you're doing. While I do not agree with Kristen's stance, it's important for everyone to be free to express themselves in our country. I'm vaccinated and a volunteer first responder, so I would encourage everyone to get vaccinated. But attacking people, as so many in the media and on both sides do, will never convince them to join your side, but rather force them to dig in further. We must truly listen, understand where they're coming from, and then give our opinions and let them make the best decision that they can. You can always catch more flies with honey than vinegar." So we really appreciate that, Matthew. You know, I think that
well said, Matthew. Thank you. Yes.
Gets to exactly what we're getting at there, and it's nice to know that we were heard. And it was a big week for new supporters, and I think in part because of that message. So thank you so much. And of course, if you want to become a supporter, whether it's on Patreon, that's patreon.com/politicsguys, or PayPal, or Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys, you get that second full-length episode every week, which comes out at the same time as our regular episode, as well as other things at different levels of support. And again, patreon.com/politicsguys to check it out. And if you are not able financially to support the show, but you would like that bonus episode every week, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. All right. So today we are going to be talking about that last-minute stopgap government funding bill, the debt ceiling, the status, as Jay suggested, of the delayed infrastructure and $3.5 trillion budget resolution bills, President Biden's sinking approval rating, testimony of top Pentagon officials before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and the Protecting Our Democracy Act. And as always, we will not get to all of that on this show, but we will get to all of it on our bonus show, which, as I said, is released at the same time now. But before we get to any of that, we are going to take a quick break, and then we will be right back to start things off. Okay, Jay, so to start things off, as I said, at the last possible moment, Congress acted to avert, or I guess at least postpone, a government shutdown by passing a continuing resolution that funds the federal government at current levels until December 3rd. The CR also includes $28.6 billion in disaster relief funding, along with $6.3 billion for resettlement of Afghan refugees. And the measure passed largely along party lines at 220 to 211 in the House, and there was a solid bipartisan majority in the Senate, 65 to 35. You know, I noticed in looking over the no votes in the Senate, all from Republicans, as you'd expect, they included that, I would say, the half dozen Republican senators who've been mentioned as potential 2024 presidential candidates, and Cotton, Cruz, Hawley, Rubio, Sass, and Scott in alphabetical order there. Now, the measure passed the Senate only...
Did you alphabetize them yourself?
I actually just...
Did you take the time to do the... Wow.
No, that's how the Senate website lists them that way, so that's how I did it. So, yeah, I can't take credit for the alphabetizing.
That's a next level preparation.
Yeah. But anyway, you know, it only passed the Senate after Majority Leader Schumer made a deal with Republicans that allowed them to get votes on a number of amendments, including one amendment that would prohibit the use of federal funds in support of President Biden's vaccine mandate for businesses with over 100 employees. And those amendments all failed, but they weren't really intended to pass. Republicans just wanted them so they could have a vote on the record to use in the 2022 midterms. So, Jay, did anything about this surprise you? And would you have voted with Mitch McConnell in favor of it, or would you have sided with the Republicans who voted against it, which included, weirdly to me, Ohio Republican Senator Rob Portman, because he has a pretty generally moderate record and he's retiring, so no real political cost. But anyway, what are your thoughts on this, the CR?
Yeah, I probably would have voted with Senate Leader McConnell. I probably typically would, right? I mean, no, and look, I think this was a Republican win, in that they got essentially the clean bill they wanted, right? That there's an extension. They avoided the argument that they've somehow shut down the government, but at the same time they're keeping everybody's feet to the fire by setting by making it only run through December. So, look, this is what McConnell wanted, and I often lament with Republicans, sort of the Casey Stengel, can't anyone here play this game? But Mitch McConnell played the game, and he played it well, and kudos to him. I don't think you and I, when we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, neither one of us believed that we would reach this, shutdown type thing. It was brinksmanship, and someone would do something eventually, and they did. So, I'm in the same position. I'm completely unsurprised about that. CRs are just basically a matter of course at this point, and so I think it was pretty unsurprising. And I actually think this was kind of the way it should have gone. I was not crazy about tying the CR to the debt ceiling. In any case, I think they're two separate things, and so I'm perfectly fine with how this happened. And speaking, and I should have made that more clear. What I was talking about when I said clean bill. That's what the Democrats had wanted, was a vote sort of on both at the same time. And Republicans are very much opposed to giving Democrats a free pass on the debt ceiling.
Absolutely. And speaking of the debt ceiling, nothing much has changed really with that, though this week Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said that even with the extraordinary measures the department is taking, the debt ceiling will be reached by October 18th. But she also said, that's only an estimate, and that this uncertainty underscores the critical importance of not waiting to raise or suspend the debt limit. And Yellen also this week voiced support for legislation introduced in May that would repeal the debt ceiling entirely. She noted that as Congress makes these decisions and approves these decisions on taxes and spending, it should also provide the ability to essentially honor those prior obligations. And I wanted to get your take on that. I mean, Janet Yellen knows a lot about the economy. She's not only an economist, not only the Treasury Secretary, but she's also the former chair of the Federal Reserve. And so what do you think about, her idea saying, let's just repeal the debt ceiling entirely?
I think that would be, I don't want to say disastrous. That's probably overstating it, because in real life, what the debt ceiling operates as is something of a speed bump, right? It's not a wall. It's not a hard limit. It is sort of a warning, if you will, right? That you get, you get from your credit card company and say, look, you're almost maxed out. But please feel free to apply for more credit. So, I mean, the debt ceiling has never, in a meaningful way, right, really stopped the U.S. from acquiring more debt. But I think there's an argument that it slowed it down a little bit, right? That it requires Congress to be a little bit intentional, to pay a little bit of attention to this issue. Otherwise, I think, and that's done just because you then have to have these votes every now and again to raise it, and it brings up the issue. And at some point, there are going to be some politicians who will be stung with this. Although, look, I mean, these kind of issues aren't sexy and don't tend to win elections, unfortunately. But so I think it's important to have it there as that sort of speed bump, if nothing else.
Yeah, and I guess I've thought about this, and I sort of see your point in that it puts people on the record as voting to increase this. So it does increase the potential political pain, I guess you could say, or the consequences for doing that. But I also think the other argument is saying, well, if you're concerned about that, you take care of it on the other end, because if you're borrowing, basically you're making these commitments, and if you're going to make these commitments, you're going to honor them. But your point, of course, is that, well, we will eventually honor them, but maybe, if I understand you correctly, you're saying maybe the fact that debt ceiling is always looming makes it at least slightly more difficult for members of Congress to engage in more deficit spending or lowering taxes, I guess, and lowering revenue. Is that sort of?
No,
yeah.
it adds just a little bit of fiscal responsibility, or at least injects that issue into the discussion.
Yeah, I think it may be more injects it into the discussion as opposed to adding it in a meaningful way, certainly. But
right, no, and I think there's something to that, because what usually happens is, yes, we're reaching the debt limit. But it's well, we gotta raise it.
Yeah.
There's never any sort of discussion of, okay, well then we immediately have to rein in spending. We immediately have to do this, or the wheels will come off. Yeah. The other weird thing about just the debt and so forth, and this goes back to Alexander Hamilton and so forth. To some extent, it's almost like the U.S. debt isn't meant to be ever completely paid off.
Sure.
Right. It's revolving. It's a revolving debt, and it's the idea is that sort of by issuing that debt, you sort of expand you leverage your economic power, and you get buy-in essentially from debt holders for the country. And again, that goes way back, and I'm not enough of an economist to explain it in really great simple terms, but I don't, the debt will never be paid off. It's just sort of always continually refinanced, partially paid off, partially reaccrued. But at some point, you start running into the issue of interest payments on the debt eating up more and more of your budget. Which can really cramp one's style. Now, we've been fortunate in the last 10 years or so with historically low interest rates that these refinancing and taking on additional debt have been able to be accomplished at relatively low cost.
Yeah, now's the time to borrow.
In terms of that.
Absolutely.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, but still, debt's still debt. So.
Yeah. And what's going to happen, I think you and I both agree, is that Democrats will end up having to raise the debt ceiling, not suspend it, but raise it through reconciliation. It's pretty clear that you talked about McConnell not giving and Senate Republicans not giving the Democrats a free pass on that, make them put their feet to the fire, which to me belies your argument of the Republicans not knowing how to play this game. McConnell is a master at this game, for better or for worse.
I just said McConnell is he's maybe the one who does. There is one other person, which we'll hit in a minute, about who really knows how to play this game. But go ahead.
But Democrats are going to have, under reconciliation rules, they're going to have to raise it by a specific number. I've been thinking about this, and I think they should make it a ridiculous number. So that it's harder to use against them in a way. Well, I don't mean like a ridiculous number, like, oh my God, they raised it to $30 trillion or something like that. I think if I were writing the legislation, I'd raise it to $1 quadrillion. That's 10 to the 45th power, or 1 followed by 45 zeros. And the reason why is it's a lot harder, I think, to sort of that accomplishes the goal of essentially eliminating the debt ceiling, but also it's a number that just sounds inherently silly. Whereas if you say, my God, they raised the debt ceiling by $5 or $10 trillion more, it's like, that sounds awful to some people. But saying that, well, it's a quattro decillion now, like, what the hell is that? So that's my free advice to the Democratic caucus there. Go with a quattro decillion. Now, maybe that's not silly enough for you. There are plenty of, look at a table of large numbers, that sort of thing. But that would be my advice. One quattro decillion, I think, should be the debt limit.
Right. No, to your point on that, and I'll be guilty of this. I think that there is just a difficulty that Republicans and conservatives have had over the years on spending issues because people's minds kind of blank out when they start considering those kind of numbers, or the inability to put those kind of numbers in context.
Absolutely.
And I'm somebody who's interested in this and follows this sort of stuff. And even to me, that happens, right? Where you're talking about, the difference between a 3.5 trillion spending and 1.5 trillion. It just doesn't seem like real numbers. And everyone sort of knows, well, how much does the government spend? I don't know, $50 bazillion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's no sense of and that's always a problem, arguing the fiscal conservative, the fiscally conservative argument is it's tough to show that direct link between government spending and people's lives.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's just always been sort of a rhetorical hurdle to get over. And I don't know that anyone's ever done it really well. And hopefully we'll start doing it better.
Well, I of course, my hope is just the opposite, so I'm okay with that. But yeah, but I think on that larger policy point, you agree that there's no way. I mean, the business community, there's pretty strong agreement that this is not going to happen. And so even though, exactly. So this will be taken care of sometime before October 18th, and the Democrats will have to specify a number, and it's probably not going to be a quattro decillion, and that is going to be something that Republicans will attempt to use against them in the midterm elections.
Sure,
absolutely.
Although I think what's going to be interesting is, will the Republicans be able to hold firm?
I think so.
As we get closer to that.
Yeah, I think so. Because I think this is a game of chicken that they know they can't lose, because there is a way for the Democrats to actually pass this without any Republican votes. And so I think McConnell will keep his caucus entirely in line on that. And so, yeah, that's my expectation.
Yeah, well, no, it's not. That's not my question. Maybe I should have phrased it differently. It's not so much whether McConnell will keep his caucus in line, is can Schumer keep his caucus in line first, right? Because if Schumer can't keep his caucus in line and says, I just don't have the votes, so Mitch, the world's going to end now. Do you have defectors? Yeah,
I don't think that. No, all the Democrats are always more willing to vote for increasing the debt ceiling than Republicans. So yeah, they have the votes. It's not going to be that. I don't think that's going to happen. No. So, but we will see within a matter of a few weeks. So, in fact, we will be doing the show that week when the debt ceiling is breached or not, and so we will almost certainly be talking about that again, and we will pat ourselves on the back for our fine predictions. Though this was, I think, kind of an easy one. So, anyway, before we get to what you alluded to in the open, that is the status of the infrastructure bill and that $3.5 trillion spending measure, we're going to take one more break, and then we will be right back. All right. So as I said, our next story, we're going to talk about, the two sort of clearly linked bills at this point. Those two, I would call them potentially presidency-defining pieces of legislation before Congress. That's the $1 trillion infrastructure bill and that $3.5 trillion House budget resolution. Well, at this point, they still are both in limbo, despite considered efforts by House Democratic leaders and President Biden to push through the infrastructure bill, which was previously approved by a bipartisan Senate majority. President Biden, appearing with Speaker Pelosi on Friday afternoon, said, "We're going to get this done. It doesn't matter when. It doesn't matter whether it's in 6 minutes, 6 days, or 6 weeks, we're going to get it done. But in a closed-door meeting with congressional Democrats, the president reportedly also acknowledged that the linkage of the infrastructure bill and the budget resolution is just reality. Now, in a letter to her caucus, Pelosi seconded Biden's optimism about the eventual passage of both bills, as well as their linkage, writing, "Clearly, the bipartisan infrastructure bill will pass once we have agreement on the reconciliation bill." Now, the infrastructure bill, as Jay mentioned earlier, was initially scheduled to take place on Thursday. Then Speaker Pelosi delayed it after House progressives said they're going to withhold their votes until they get more of what they want in the upcoming $3.5 trillion spending measure. And Pelosi then made assurances that there would be a vote on Friday, which there wasn't. And really, I think this comes as no surprise to anyone who's been paying attention, because the most liberal House members have said all along that they wouldn't go along with the infrastructure bill unless they could vote for that larger spending measure. But the problem,
right, and unless they, and not only that, unless that larger spending measure passed first.
yeah, and the problem, of course, is that that just isn't going to fly in the Senate. On Thursday, Senator Manchin said he would not support a bill that had a price tag of more than $1.5 trillion, and that's way off from what House progressives want. And Manchin also said that he wanted to see means testing for any new social spending in the bill. Also, he wanted assurances that nothing in that bill would eliminate the production and use of fossil fuels, important for a senator from West Virginia. And Manchin also, while he said he's largely okay with the tax increase proposals in the legislation, that's a problem apparently for Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who said she's not in favor of significant tax increases. And that infrastructure bill, which passed in the Senate in early August, actually, and that was 69-30, that includes $550 billion in new spending and would add $256 billion to the deficit over the next decade, according to the CBO. And key provisions of that didn't end up passing, and it's 2,700 pages. I haven't read the whole thing. I'm guessing you haven't either,
Yes,
Jay.
and the grand total cost on that one, as I understand, again, depending on how you score it, is roughly in the again, $1.5 trillion.
But only 550 in new spending. That's important to point out.
I get it. Yeah.
But well, before we get into specifics of any of those bills, what's your take on just the politics of all this and how you see it playing out?
First, I do need to take a victory lap in that this is, as I have foreseen, I think on the show that I did with Trey back in, it was probably sometime back in August, right? That this is exactly where we were heading. And here we are. Trey disagreed. He thought, they'll just pass both of them and it'll be smooth sailing. But that is not the case. And at this point, Nancy Pelosi no longer really controls the House Democrat caucus, I don't think. I think AOC and the squad do. And that's a big problem. When you've got an infrastructure bill, which should be an easy layup for your caucus, you would probably even get some House Republicans who would vote with you on that, because infrastructure generally, even human infrastructure, right, as this bill has broadly defined it, is generally pretty politically popular. And for a couple reasons. One, it actually gives you something tangible. Second, it creates actual, real, good-paying, typically private sector jobs that go along with it. And it gives politicians something to point to of saying, "Hey, I got this bridge fixed. I got this road repaved," that sort of thing. But
let me say, Jay,
and it's also, this is the type of bill that Pelosi's most vulnerable members, those moderates or those Democrats who won in Trump-leaning districts, need to be able to run for re-election.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the benefits of infrastructure, and we'll get into the policy aspects of that. But the idea that the squad controls Congress is laughable. And I get the squad's a big boogeyman to you folks on the right, but it's just they may control Twitter, our political Twitter to a certain extent, but they don't control Congress. It's just a matter of votes. This is what happens when you have razor thin majorities in your chamber, and those groups to have those final votes, or anyone who can band together like that, they have outsized influence. So they don't control Congress any more than the House moderates do, because let me finish here. Let's keep in mind that the House progressives initially wanted somewhere between $6 to $10 trillion in this larger bill. They're not going to get anything close to that. And so this idea that this is some big win for progressives, I think this is just the media looking for an angle, and it's just not the case, because in the end, both of these bills are going to pass. And all of this inside baseball, internal negotiating stuff, none of it's going to matter, because both of these bills are huge. And when they pass, and they both will pass, Democrats will, campaign on having made massive transformative changes to help regular Americans, and I think that's absolutely the case, as well as pointing out that on the infrastructure bill, which will eventually pass, I agree with the president on this, that was something that President Trump, congressional Republicans said that they would do when they were in charge, but they failed to do. So this is all just will end up in the wash. It's not a big deal at all, and everything's going to be fine.
Okay. Well, I think you're kind of whistling past the graveyard.
No, not at all. I am willing to stay.
It wasn't fine on Thursday.
No, sure it was. This is just inside.
The squad is in control of Congress. Well, they were in control of Congress on Thursday, and they were in control of Congress on Friday.
Well, I guess what do you mean by control, Jay?
They'll both pass. I mean, and that may be the case.
Let's be clear.
They'll both pass in their current form.
Well, no, they're not going to pass in their current form. It's about compromise. The Democratic caucus is, there are a variety of views, and both sides are going to compromise. And even the House progressives understand that. And so here's what's going to happen. Manchin and Sinema will come up on their end to somewhere around $2 trillion. House progressives will either have to take it or get nothing, because one thing that all of the congressional Democrats know is that the window to make this happen is not going to be open that much longer, certainly not forever. And if both sides don't end up compromising, it's really likely that is it in terms of big policy changes in the Biden administration, at least until after 2025, if everything breaks exactly right electorally, which I don't think is going to happen for the Democrats. So this is no big deal. This is all going to blow over, and we're going to end up with that. Basically, we're going to end up with the infrastructure deal that the Senate passed, and we're going to end up with around $2 trillion in the other bill, and it's all going to be good.
So, and that's similar to what you and I both predicted months ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's be clear on that. What I think, so going back to what I alluded to a minute ago, the other person who very much knows how to play this game is Joe Manchin. So a newscast the other day, Jonah Goldberg referred to him as acting president Joe Manchin. And I think he's right to some extent. This is sort of an underreported story in the mainstream media, but for weeks now, Senator Schumer has been attacking Manchin, and progressives have been attacking Manchin, saying, well, look, what do you want? Give me a number. And the implication being, well, no one ever gave me a number or told me what it is that Manchin is seeking. Well, then it turns out there is a signed agreement between Schumer and Manchin, signed by both of them, where Manchin says, look, what I'm looking for is 1.5. And with the other caveats that you mentioned on the fossil fuels. Also, an interesting piece of that is sort of the idea that he wants to spend down the COVID relief funds before new money gets spent, which seems reasonable. But this really puts the lie to the line that Schumer's been pushing for some time, is like, well, look, I'd like to negotiate, but no one will give me a number, and I'm not going to negotiate against myself, that sort of thing. So yeah, Joe Manchin knows how to play the game and knows what he's doing. And I think in the he's sort of put himself right into a position where it's not going to be easy for him to simply move off his 1.5 the other side has to move first. So I think that's going to be something interesting to watch. I don't know how that's going to end up. Like I said, I think we end up somewhere south of $2 trillion, just because there's I think Manchin will need that. That's just a symbolic kind of number.
Yeah.
The other thing that the Manchin had pushed for, and which I think is sort of fun to mention, and this is sort of when we talk about these numbers of between 3.5 and 1.5 trillion, is asking for some sort of sense of where the money goes and where it's going to be spent and how it's going to be spent. And I think we get to sort of the bizarreness of what are we going to do for the economy? Well, we'll spend 3.5 trillion. And the question is on what? Well, green stuff, environment, building back better, as opposed to the more rational type proposal of we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and this is how much it's going to cost. Here are the programs we're going to fund. It's more, let's come up with a number, and then we'll backfill it later with what we're actually going to do with that number. So
yeah, I don't know that that's really. I think we have a pretty good idea of where the money is going for both of those. In fact, maybe that's. I think I'd like to kind of shift into that because we've been talking so much about the politics of it, but obviously this legislation, both pieces, are big enough to be transformative, and so for better or worse, depending on how you look at it. And so I think it's worth looking at it from that perspective. In fact, we had a question last week in our Discord group, Jordan, who suggested, we talk about what are the things in both of these pieces of legislation that we like, dislike, would change, and that seemed like a pretty good idea to me. So maybe we could start with the infrastructure bill. And just as a reminder to folks, that is a little over $1 trillion with, I said, like $550 billion in new spending. And key provisions of that: $110 billion for bridges and roads, $66 billion for passenger rail, with the biggest share of that going to maintenance and improvements in Amtrak's pretty heavily utilized Northeast Corridor routes, $65 billion for expanding high-speed internet access, $64 billion for updating and securing the power grid, $55 billion for water infrastructure, $47 billion for cybersecurity and climate change, $39 billion for public transit, and $25 billion for airports. Those are kind of the mainline items on that. So when you look at that bill, Jed, that was a bill that passed with a pretty strong bipartisan majority in the Senate. How do you feel about that just passing as it is?
I would agree to passing that as it is. There's parts in there I don't like that I think are not really infrastructure, right? There's all this additional job training. There's other additional social programs that are being billed as human infrastructure. I don't think that really belongs in the bill, but fixing roads, bridges, waterways, securing the grid, I think those are all good goals. As with any government program, it typically will probably cost more than it ought to and take longer than it ought to, but this is still stuff we have to do. And these are things that I would say most Americans and most Republicans, conservatives would say this is a proper role of government, right? This is this fundamental infrastructure kind of piece. So with that, I could quibble about the number. And quibble about some of the uses, but for the most part, I think the infrastructure bill is not overly objectionable.
Yeah,
and which to me is, like I said, I think that's why it ought to be an easy political layup for the House.
And it'll get done. But my only issue with it is I don't think it's big enough, especially the traditional infrastructure stuff, because you can look at all sorts of different analysis, and it's pretty clear that there's a huge infrastructure spending gap. And, the longer you wait on infrastructure maintenance and improvements, the worse shape you're usually in. So not only that, but a number of studies have found that this is actually a really solid, more than pays for itself investment. There's a guy, engineer and a researcher named Henry Petrosky, who actually I interviewed on the podcast a few years ago. He found that traffic congestion by itself costs over $120 billion every year. There's also a study from the University of Maryland back in 2014 found that for every $1 invested in infrastructure, you get around $3 more in GDP growth. Now, obviously, that trails off at a certain point. We're really underinvested right now, but we're nowhere near that point. So, I mean, if I were writing the infrastructure bill, just the roads and bridges part of the bill would be around $1 trillion, and power grid and all that. So I think there's a good case to be made for that. But I understand the political realities, and you take what you can get. And I will be very happy when this bill passes, and I think it's going to be a good thing for the country. So that's kind of where
like I said, I can certainly live with it. Although I have no doubt that there are bits and pieces hidden in there that I don't like. I talked a couple months ago about our dumb bike path, right, that was been installed. There's going to be stuff like that, right? That stuff that no one really needs, no one really wants, and is not a great idea. But hey, here's some money for it, so we have to build it. So I suspect there's going to be some of that, but on the bigger picture, I'm generally okay with the infrastructure for those reasons that you point out, right? Yeah. It gives you there's something tangible there. There's a tangible asset that you now have. So.
Yeah. So now I think what's going to be more disagreement between us is on that $3.5 trillion budget resolution. And of course, at that spending level, we'd need a whole show and maybe a series of shows to go through all the major items in any kind of detail. But just to kind of a quick overview, and we've talked about this before, the major items in the resolution as it stands now: free preschool, free community college, long-term elder care through Medicaid, new dental, hearing, and vision benefits in Medicare, lower drug costs by allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices, an extension of the recently expanded child tax credit, pretty significant green energy and climate mitigation investments. There was the citizenship thing, but that was pulled because of the parliamentarian. We talked about that last week. And also tax code revisions targeted at those who make over $400,000 a year, as well as big corporations. So I'll start on this one. Why don't you start on this one? Is there anything you like in this?
Not particularly. Look, I think there are some things that you and I have talked about that could make sense and could be smart policy changes. Some of the elder care stuff. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. I think is there a better way for our country to handle that? Yeah, I think there is. Is this the way to do it? No. Throwing it all together in this monster bill. No. And again, when you get to these big, huge pieces, you find out what's in it after you pass it. That's really no way to run a railroad. The other thing to consider is just the sheer enormity of this. Remember back in 2009, when President Obama was pushing for the stimulus bill, which passed with some bipartisan support. It was roughly $1 trillion, or just under $1 trillion. And that was in the sense of, listen, we need to do something immediately as a stimulus to get us out of the worst economic conditions since the Great Depression. It was sort of national emergency type legislation. And still, and this is in 2009, a little over 10 years ago, the big concern was, this is crazy. We've never spent this much money before. And now we're talking about spending more than 3 times that amount of money. That's not even including the infrastructure stuff, right? 4 times that amount, including the infrastructure. When the economy is, in many ways, certainly not perfect, but you don't have anywhere close to the unemployment that you did, or the economic issues that you had during the Great Recession. It sort of assumes that, again, our problem right now isn't, lack of a stimulus, right, to get the economy moving. It's almost the other issue that it's being held back by inflation, by what I would argue is too much money being pumped into the system, and too few goods and too few people producing them. So that's I just think, to put this in perspective of the why exactly do we need this biggest transformational expenditure?
And the argument from the left, and I certainly support this argument fully, is that
You always do.
well, no, I don't always do, and that's not the case.
No, I'm saying
but-
the left. That's the argument. Is
sure.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying there. Yeah.
I'm not saying you. I'm
Okay,
saying,
gotcha. The argument from the left, and in this case, I certainly support it, is that there are some pretty major holes in our social welfare system, and this is particularly an opportunity, a rare moment in time where we might have the ability. There is that small political window to do something about that. Like, for instance, the idea that if you are on Medicare, your dental, hearing, and vision, that isn't covered. That's always seemed to me to be just really bizarre. Or the fact that Medicare can't negotiate with drug companies to lower prices. That always seemed bizarre to me. There are other parts of this that maybe I'm a little less, I could be persuaded maybe aren't the best investments given where we are fiscally, but things like that, or extending the child tax credit. I think that to me, yes, absolutely. Now, I largely agree with Senator Manchin that it maybe makes sense to means test more of these things. And like, for instance, take the child care tax credit. Right now, it was recently expanded, as I mentioned, $3,600 for children 5 and under, $3,000 for kids that are 6 to 17. Then the first phase out is at $150,000 joint household income, then another one at $400,000. Well, I think you could make an argument of saying that make it more for people in, for instance, household incomes of $50,000 or below, which that sounds really low, doesn't it? But that's like 37% of all households in this country are at $50,000 or below household income, and then make the phase outs at a lower level to give more money to the people who need it the most. So I would be in favor of targeting it much more. The same thing for community college. I'm not actually in favor of free to everyone community college. I think what would make a lot more sense, for instance, would be to expand the Pell Grant program. And that's specifically, again, targeted to lower income students. Now, I should point out that, not surprisingly, this legislation does that as well. It raises it from around $6,500 to $13,000 per year by 2028. But given the fact that right now, the average cost of tuition at a public in-state college is just over $10,000 a year, and it's going to be a lot more than that by 2028. I think the simple thing to do is just raise up the Pell Grants and not try to do a free for everyone sort of thing. But I get the universality of it, because when you make
universality.
Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. The universality of it, because when you make social welfare programs universal, it locks them in a lot more. But I also think that that's the kind of spending that's the most questionable, though certainly giving these benefits to the more politically active classes who need them less, that's smart politics, but I don't think it's the best policy.
Well, you sound like Joe Manchin without the twang there. I mean,
yeah. Well, yeah. Of course, I have a different view from him on the fossil fuel thing, but yeah. I mean, I'm a centrist Democrat, so yeah. I think that there is something to be said for that. So absolutely. But I wonder,
So what I'm saying is, I would, you asked me would I support the infrastructure bill. I mean, would you support 3.5 trillion, or would you pare that back a little bit with some of the, you said means testing and perhaps limiting some of these, targeting these programs a little bit to certain populations and end up at a significant lower number.
Yeah, that's what I'd like to see. I think that's what I believe we're going to end up with. And I mean, from a political standpoint, it makes sense, because the middle and wealthier classes, those are the most politically active, the most politically powerful. And so when something big happens, they want their piece, and doing things that's just for the poor, well, they don't vote, there aren't. So that's the sad reality. And so I'm for anything that targets the most aid to the people who need it most. And a happy consequence of that is that means that it increases the deficit less. So yeah, I think that's a win-win kind of thing.
So, and this is maybe a little bit of a tangent on the child tax credit. So what are your thoughts in the extent that, look, the child tax credit, of which I benefit from, even again, Mike, as you pointed out, the plutocrats like myself benefit from some of these programs. Is this sort of moving towards almost like is child tax credit the new universal basic income?
I guess for people who want to have kids, but I think it's way too low to be anything.
You should get on the train on that, Mike. I mean, you can't just
the train's left the station a while ago, but I mean, certainly, I don't think there's anyone who's saying, we should have kids because it's a good financial proposition. Because I think, as anyone with kids would say, is that the idea of $3,600 to raise a kid 5 and under for a year, that's not going to pay for itself, So
yeah, I don't know, but just the idea that, because again, I don't think that people make these decisions based on how much they're going to get from the government. But they, if you say, hey, every year I get an extra, because this is important, the credit is fully refundable.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. It's not just we're going to credit this against your other taxes up to the point where you owe money. It's to the point of, even if you are paying no taxes, you get this money. So you could well say, hey, you know what? Government gives me $10,000-$12,000 every year. Can't beat that. I mean, that is sort of a form of, again, it's not universal basic income in that, look, I can live off this and not work, but it's sort of entrenching that kind of permanent subsidy. And I think that's kind of problematic, because those things, as you point out, don't shrink, and if anything, they tend to expand.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I don't see it as. But the difference is, I don't see it as problematic any more than I see entrenching the subsidy of Social Security and Medicare for people over 65. I said, yes, let's entrench that. Let's entrench it, and let's raise it up so that people who are in the most dire economic need don't have to be concerned about where they're next, how they're going to afford both heat and rent and food. So yeah, I am totally in favor of entrenching. Let's entrench that sucker as hard as we can. Absolutely.
I don't doubt it. Yeah.
Yeah. But which is not to say, and you're going to get comments on this, because you always get comments about being out of touch as the plutocrat you are. You're not saying let the poor figure out what to do on their own.
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that every time you create a new subsidy, there is a lobbying group interest that springs up to protect and expand it, and that these things seldom go away. And if you're someone like me who is concerned about debts and deficit, and the fact that the more you increase entitlements, the less you have to spend on discretionary spending. That this is bad news.
Yeah, right? This is where you and I differ.
I would say, and I would make the argument that generally, the more people have to rely on government to survive or to get by, or to perceive that they need to rely on government, I think that's bad on a whole lot of fronts.
Yeah,
on a productivity front, on a democracy front, on a freedom front, on all that. Yeah.
And I just think it's just sad and tragic and pitiful how weak and full of holes our social safety net is in the largest economy in the world, compared to so many other countries who do it so much better than we do, and they're not totalitarian horrific states, and so and that's it's just a fundamental difference of values, I guess, in that sense. And so as I said, I think a few weeks ago, right on the show, or a few months ago, saying that Democrats and Republicans, or liberals and conservatives, look at this spending and they could say the exact same thing. This is going to make us more like Western Europe. And on my side, I'm like, yeah, let's bring it on, baby. And on your side, you're like, oh my God. Right? And that's right. Where we're at. So yeah.
Give me my freedom prize. Yeah.
Yeah. If we could be more like the Nordic countries, especially, I'm signing on for that in a big way.
All right.
All right. So, before, one other thing I wanted to ask you about in this, this has been talked about before. What do you think about, and this might be a standalone thing, but that idea of allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices? I mean, that to me seems like kind of like a market sort of thing. And I don't know. I might have asked you about that before in other contexts, but do you think that's
we've had this discussion before, and my concern is always it's less about what Medicare negotiating prices and more about Medicare dictating prices.
Well, yeah,
right?
and certainly that gives them more power to do. But don't you also feel like when you look at just the fact that U.S. drug prices are so much higher and we're essentially subsidizing the rest of the world, that, you know, kind of in Trumpian terms, we're being played for suckers by big pharma.
Well, I think we're being played by suckers for the rest of the world is probably more apt. But my concern,
America first, Jay.
You start putting these, you know, what are essentially price controls on something like pharmaceuticals, you're going to get less of them. You're going to take away the incentive to create and to you know, have more of these drugs, and that's my bigger concern, right? My daughter's on insulin, has to be, will be for her entire life, and you know, there's this one, you know, line of argument that says, well, okay, well, the government should just pay for that and it'll be free. Okay, fair enough. But if the government doesn't pay a significant amount where companies are still making money on it, they're just going to stop producing it, and that leads to shortages. And I think that is, to me, a bigger concern, the shortages rather than.
Well, I get that. I get that argument, but the fact of the matter is, right, that we're essentially being not the arsenal of democracy, but the arsenal of, I don't know, pharmaceuticals, because we are providing this subsidy. And so are you saying that that's basically just how it has to be? Because it's not like all these other countries are going to say, oh, we will remove our price controls so that the United States bears less of a burden.
Well, no, I mean, what could happen is these pharmaceutical companies could say to the other countries, here's the price. We don't care what your price controls are. If you want to subsidize that price through your ample social welfare net, please go ahead and feel free to do so. But here's what it costs us to produce it. You were entitled to make a legitimate profit off that. Hey guys, we just saved the world from COVID. You know, I think that would be the approach.
Yeah, well, you know, and again, there certainly are heroic researchers who care deeply about humanity and making people's lives better in the pharmaceutical industry, no question in my mind. But the idea that the people in the corporate suite are sitting there saying, you know, we are these non-self-interested heroes who are just concerned about saving the world, and we just want to make a little bit of profit. I mean, you can go too far the other way.
No, you're completely that's sort of exactly my argument. Is these people are not selfless.
Okay.
And we shouldn't expect them to be.
No, not at all.
Right?
Not
I mean, you know, look, I really like my job. I enjoy what I do most of the time, but would I just do it for free? No.
Yeah.
And I expect neither would you.
No, definitely.
And not. So I think that's sort of the idea, is a lot of these folks would say, look, you know, take, for example, people who are doing the coronavirus research. They're doing it under dangerous conditions, dealing with this virus. They are probably some of the best and brightest and spent years and years in you know, top-notch educational institutions getting where they are, worked with all kinds of other dangerous viruses getting where they are. They have incredibly, you know, big pressures on them from the public, from the government, from their employers to get this done, to get it right, to get it done quickly. And then you're going to say, well, you know, we're not going to pay you quite as much as, you know, we and you know, you could then just look and say, well, hey, I can do, you know, get a better paying job doing something different that doesn't involve dealing with deadly viruses. And you know, that's what they'll do. Likewise, companies can say, look, this line of work, and you see this a lot, right, with pharmaceuticals. This is often a big complaint about them, is they make a whole lot more selling a sort of basic, you know, high blood pressure drug that everybody or you have a huge volume of people who need and take than they do researching and working on certain rare diseases. Just because the market isn't there, right? There's not that market incentive, and that's my concern. Is the more you curtail their ability to make a profit,
I hear
the
your
less
argument.
they're going to invest there. And Mike, the answer to that isn't government subsidies; it's more competition across pharmaceutical companies, right?
How do you create that? Well, this gets into a different.
It's Pfizer saying, "Look, we want to get ours done for this much and make this profit," and Moderna saying, "No, we're going to, sell it for this much," and that's where you have the price control.
Yeah. Then you get into the
market.
whole.
I mean, that's sort of the basic. I mean, our whole antitrust regime is built on that premise that the best way to control prices is through a vibrant market. So.
Well, that we could get into our whole antitrust regime and how
you introduced sort of the giant gorilla of Medicare, Medicaid. That would what's the word I'm looking for? Deform that market or I don't know.
I understand what you're saying. It's called a monopsony when you have. One buyer or one huge buyer essentially, and that would force
doesn't control everything, but is controls enough to.
Well, I think I think your concern for the welfare of the pharmaceutical companies is perhaps greater than it should be. And I also think that there's some middle ground between driving them into the ground and, regulations or basically saying they can make not enough money to keep going and just basically saying they can do whatever the hell they want. I do think there is a middle ground. And I think properly written, giving Medicare at least some sort of ability to negotiate within certain bounds would be reasonable and a good thing. But we could do a whole show on the pharmaceutical industry and antitrust, and maybe we will. In fact, I think in the next, recently I interviewed Eric Posner, who's a writer on researcher on antitrust, and hopefully I'll have that interview up in the next week or two. Some pretty interesting things about that. But anyway, one more thing I think we have time for in this show, and that's kind of related to all of this stuff, really. President Biden's sinking approval rating. Just Friday, the Associated Press, along with the National Opinion Research Center, released the results of their latest poll on Biden's job approval. And the general public is split just about right down the middle, according to this poll, 50% approve, 49% disapprove, and that represents a continuing slump for Biden, who in that poll was at 59% approval in July, 54% in August. And the drop in this particular poll is in line with other presidential approval polls. 538 keeps track of all of them, basically all the big ones, and they currently have their average of polls at 48.7 disapproval to 45% approval, so even worse for the president. Now, if you put this in historical context, we look back to really the beginning of polling, essentially. Well, Donald Trump at this point, 38.5% approval. That's pretty dreadful, actually, right? But Obama was at 52.2%. George W. Bush, 9/11 influenced that. He was at 81.1%. Bill Clinton at 52.5%. And if you look, again, way back to the advent of modern presidential polling, that's the Truman administration, Biden is right now below every single one of the other 12 presidents in that period, with the exception of Trump. And so the question is, well, how big of a deal is this? And what sort of ramifications, if any, does this have for 2022 and 2024? So what do you think, Jay? Is this something where Biden and Democrats should be like, oh, wow, or not good, or Republicans should be kind of licking their chops?
Yeah, it's not good. And the bigger number to look at is, where does that approval stand with his own party, right? I mean, if you go into these things, and it makes sense that most of the time these things hover around 50%, especially, and we're just coming out of a fairly close election, that, most partisans are going to say, no, I approve, no, I disapprove. So what's more significant is how many members of his own party are now disapproving of his job performance, and even more significant than that are how many independent voters. Where are they on this question? And I think the numbers there on the independents are it's really pretty dire. So yeah, I think that's not great, and especially going into midterms. I mean, what this does is it handicaps the president's ability to help candidates in midterms who are in swing districts.
Yeah, and to me, I don't see it as a big deal at all. I mean, Afghanistan is part of the reason for the drop, and that's a short-term blip because plenty of evidence suggests that Americans typically don't care for long about foreign policy unless U.S. troops or U.S. citizens are being killed. And
the 100 or so who are still there, I'm sure they care about it, but
I don't.
Well, to the extent they are allowed to vote absentee, I expect their approval rating is rather low at this point.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's not a concern.
I don't mean to suggest that you're denigrating that, right? I get it. You're talking in the broader picture that typically foreign policy stuff doesn't influence domestic elections.
Yeah, and
you're right. You're right on that.
And the Democrats are going to get these two bills through. And so I think once that happens, once we look back if we look forward to, and I think both of these bills are definitely going to pass by the end of the year. And so when we start looking into very early 2022, Biden's approval numbers are going to be pretty normal, not great or anything, because as you pointed out, that partisan split. But also I think COVID and post-COVID inflation, to the extent that it sticks around, can come into play. And I think assuming that we're back to something approaching kind of a maskless normal by this coming summer, I think that's going to be to Biden's benefit. And if inflation is, as I predict, is back to more or less kind of a 2-3% by then, I think his numbers are going to be pretty solid. Now, if those things don't happen, and you predicted on the inflation front that wouldn't be the case, then right. I think I was saying
5% by the end of the year.
Yeah, we'll come back to that, but
we'll see.
Yeah, but also, it seems to me like Donald Trump right now is responding to this Biden slump. He's talking and acting a lot more like a 2024 candidate. And I was curious. Every once in a while I check presidential odds. I go to Sports Betting Dime, sports odds sites. I'll put the link in the show notes there for anyone who's curious. But Donald Trump right now, the top Republican favorite, he's still below Biden and Harris, as you would expect. But he's followed by DeSantis, Haley, Pence, and then Tucker Carlson to round out the top 5 Republicans there. And I mean, do you think that this has much relation at this point on 2024? Or do you think it's just too far off to really even, be concerned about that?
Well, one thing builds on another, right? I think, the impact of Afghanistan is not going to go away, as you think.
Really? Why is that? I want to hear from you on that.
Because this is when you have something that it comes off as sort of national embarrassment, right? Like a fleeing Saigon. When you do something, and this is just looking at the actual, optics, how it would be used in political commercials, of Biden saying, being juxtaposed with saying, oh, I don't expect that anything, the Taliban's not going to take over anytime soon, and then juxtapose that with images of people, crowding the airport with caskets being unloaded from planes, with him looking at his watch, those kind of things, with his head down at the press conference. Those images, I think, are stick.
Let me ask you that.
Whether or not you want to say people are concerned about foreign policy, and I do think there is a big concern about. Look, there are still American citizens who are trying to get out of Afghanistan and can't. And this is a guy who went on TV and said everybody who wants to leave can leave, and obviously they have not been able to. I think that hurts them. The other piece is
before you get to the other piece, let me ask you the flip side of this. I mean, President Obama wanted to get out of Afghanistan to a certain extent and didn't. President Trump said that we would get out of Afghanistan, and he wasn't able to accomplish that. President Biden said we would get out of Afghanistan and end the country's longest war, and he got us out of Afghanistan and ended the country's longest war. Now, I've been on record as saying that I don't think that that was the right move. We'll get to that in the bonus show, but that also is something that's going to be used. And so I wonder to what extent that at least partially mitigates the fact that, those images and that sort of thing. I really think that because you are such a very deeply informed voter and you pay a lot of attention to this, and for you, for your entire lifetime, foreign policy is a big deal. I think you are greatly overestimating how much regular Americans who aren't nearly as politically active and involved and engaged as you and I are, how much they care about that sort of thing. And we'll find out, but that's kind of my response on the Afghanistan part.
So I think my response to that is you're kind of right, but I'm kind of making the other argument is that people maybe don't care that much about foreign policy. For the example of, if you ask anybody at any time, hey, do you think we should get out of Afghanistan? Most people would say, well, sure, right? Do we think we should be sending American troops over to some godforsaken hellhole? The answer is almost always no to that initial question. But if the question then becomes, do you think we need to project American military force to protect us against terrorism abroad? Most people would say, well, yeah, I'd think more about that. And I think you can say those are sort of the foreign policy questions. But the images of defeat, I think, are stronger, that Americans do care about that. They may care less about or may care to some extent to answer the question on, sure, I think we should get out of wars. War is bad. But
I see your point. The optics of it, sure.
Defeat.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
And also keep in mind, Afghanistan wasn't Vietnam, right? Where you had at one point up to 500,000 troops on the ground and mass casualties being reported every night. It was a different kind of war, and people marching in the street. There weren't people marching in the streets to say U.S. out of Afghanistan.
No.
So saying, look, I ended an unpopular war. Well, okay. He sort of ended a war that in a lot of cases most people had kind of forgotten about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I see your point. Yeah, so that may be, but again, we'll get more into the Afghanistan thing on the bonus show. But more generally speaking, do you think that this sort of Biden slump, if it continues, is that the sort of thing that's something that you wouldn't want, I would expect, good for Donald Trump?
Oh, I suppose it's good for Republicans across the board. Whether it's something particular to Donald Trump, I don't know that he gets. I don't know that Donald Trump gets any advantage out of it more than any other Republican.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, presidential candidate, and perhaps even maybe a little less. Right, that this opens the door for a Republican to run and say, look, let's set aside some of the ideology. What we need is just plain competence and someone who's not nuts, mercurial, sort of as Donald Trump is. And here's somebody who can handle foreign relations, can take that 3 a.m. phone call, that sort of thing. So yeah, there might even be a sense that it cuts against him, right?
Yeah,
it's like you've had kind of two brands of crazy. Although I wouldn't say Biden is crazy. It's a different sort of two brands of incompetence, I guess. And Biden campaigned on competence, and I think if you have someone who is more of a steady hand, a Mike Pencean type, maybe it helps him more, in the margins.
Yeah, well, I would think Pence is fatally flawed for other reasons, but we will continue this conversation. It's basically going to be almost a seamless continuation with more on Afghanistan because of that. I mentioned that three top Pentagon leaders testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee this week. We're also going to talk about the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which was introduced recently in the House, maybe take some listener questions as well. And all that is going to be on the bonus show, which will be available to you, well, right now if you're hearing this, and that's available to our Patreon supporters. If you're not a supporter, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys to sign up. And if you would just like to get that bonus show, but you can't afford to support the show right now, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com. And for any reason you don't want to support the show on Patreon, you have issues with Patreon, I don't know, you can also support the show through PayPal or on Venmo. We're at Politics Guys. And one thing that would really help in supporting the show that costs absolutely nothing, takes very little time, is if you could subscribe to the show if you're not already a subscriber, leave ratings and reviews, and especially if you could share the show on social media. That is a big help to us. A special thanks to as always, to our executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Chris Wilkerson, and Ryan Beasley. We'll be back with a new show for you next week. We hope to join us.